Very good. Good afternoon, everybody, both here in the OECD and on the web. My name is Anthony Cox, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Environment Directorate here at the OECD. Welcome to today's live OECD Green Talk on the topic of rethinking plastic recycling in a disposable society. Now, plastics has really risen to the top of the agenda in the last year. Barely a day has gone by in the last 12 months where you don't see some story or other about plastics in the news, be it plastics recycling, plastics pollution, plastics in the ocean, microplastics in our water supplies. Plastics has become the topic du jour. Now, what we are also seeing is there's a lot of innovation around plastic. I don't know how many people have these kind of ads pop up on their Facebook sites, on their Facebook web pages where there are solutions being proposed for buying plastic bracelets that are made out of recycled ocean plastic. There's a lot of innovation happening both at the consumer end, recycling end, and at the design end. There's a lot of innovation happening in government policy as well, perhaps not fast enough to cope with the scale of the problem that we are confronted with. But governments, national governments, are starting to take more action. And internationally, we're seeing major movements in forums such as the G7 and the G20. Now, the OECD has developed a large body of work that is addressing the issues in this area. And our aim is to support governments in their efforts to address the environmental consequences that arise from the production, use and disposal of plastics. Our work is focused very much on two strands. The first is on the cross-cutting issue on the sustainable design of plastics, and secondly on ways to improve plastics recycling. And further work is going on, including work coming up on single-use plastics and on microplastics. So today we have Peter Börkey, who is leading our work on resource productivity and waste. He's been doing this for many years now, and he will present some of the insights and policy recommendations from this work, and focusing, of course, on plastics recycling. Now, Peter's going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes on this topic, and afterwards there'll be time for questions and answers, around half an hour of time for those questions. For those of you in the room, we'll take questions from the floor, of course. And for those of you who are online, and I understand there is quite a few participants online. You can send questions at any time during the talk to the questions moderator on the chat section in your WebEx screen, and I will convey them to Peter. So this is our chance, both here in the room and online, to dig deeper into the challenging topic of plastics recycling. So, without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours. There you go.
Now it is, okay. Thank you, Anthony, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about this work that we essentially did over the last 12 months. I've heard that we have quite a crowd connected to this Green Talk today, more than 400 people. So I think it shows what you just outlined, Anthony, that there's a lot of interest in this topic these days. So my talk today is going to focus on plastics and then more specifically on plastics recycling. The background to this is a recent publication on improving markets for recycled plastics that we released not long ago. And more generally, the work that we have undertaken on the issue of plastics in the environment, and which involves a team of colleagues here in the OECD in the resource efficiency and chemicals groups. So, moving into the presentation. Plastics have, of course, become an indispensable material in our everyday life. They're contained in almost everything that we use, you know, from kitchen utensils to electrical and electronic appliances, medical appliances, medicines, cars, aeroplanes. Plastics are everywhere. And the reason for this is that the material is incredibly versatile. You can give it, you know, you can give plastic almost, you know, any type of properties and any shape. And at the same time, they're incredibly cheap. So, you know, I think in the 50s and 60s, the enthusiasm for plastics was probably greatest, and this is what you see here on this slide. It's a cover of Life magazine in August 1955. And the text there below, which you may not be able to read, says, "Throwaway living, disposable items cut down in household chores." So, you know, I think that's in a way, you know, viewed from today, a prophecy that's become true. Today we're coping in a way with, you know, that vision of the throwaway society that was designed and thought up you know, around plastics at that time. So plastics production, global plastics production, has increased exponentially since the 50s, from next to nothing to more than 400 million tons today. And the largest application of plastics are in packaging, which represents about 1/3 of the production of plastics, followed by the building and construction sector, and then consumer products and textiles. And of course, you know, the plastic that we produced at some stage turns up in the waste stream, becomes waste. And so in parallel, waste has been increasing at similar rates. And the projection is that this will continue to increase very strongly in the future. This is a graph from Roland Geyer and colleagues, which projects waste plastic arisings to 2050, and which projects a 5-fold increase in total plastic waste generation. So, you know, we are going to see a rising tide of plastics. We haven't seen the end of it, apparently. Now, when we talk about plastics, we actually simplify things quite a bit, because plastic is actually not one material, but it is in fact a set of different materials that have quite different properties. What this graphic shows is essentially the main polymer groups: polypropylene, low density polyethylene, you know, from left to right, etc., all the way to you know, PET, polystyrene, and the additives that also go into plastics. And it's an interesting graph, because what this shows is the amount of different polymers that are produced, the share of them that appear in the waste stream on an annual basis. So those would be the colored parts of those columns. And then in white, you have what actually goes into anthropogenic stocks, which you know, is basically left in the economy and left in use, essentially. And so what this graph shows is that, you know, different plastics, of course, have then very different uses. For instance, PET is essentially used in the packaging sector, mostly for bottles, and it essentially turns over within a year. It becomes waste almost as soon as it's put on the market. While other types of plastics like PVC, which is mostly used in the construction and building sector, actually remain in use for far, far longer, and therefore also appear in smaller quantities in the waste stream. So that's important background from the perspective of recycling, because there you're interested in understanding, what the feedstock is going to be. Another important thing here is, the additives. I will talk a little bit more about that. You can see that quite a large volume of additives are being added into the polymers to provide them with different properties, and sometimes these additives can be problematic from the point of view of recycling. There we go. So this is then what happens. What you see here on the slide is what happens when plastics that appear in the waste stream are poorly managed. Plastics generate a number of important environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions, at the production, but also at the end of life treatment stage, especially when they're incinerated. But the most important and visible impact, of course, is the plastic that is littered in the environment. And I think, of course, the ocean plastic litter has attracted lots of attention recently. What is worrying here is, of course, that this material is accumulating in the environment. So more and more appears in the oceans, for instance, where it's disrupting ecosystems and affecting biodiversity. But increasingly, I think scientists are also concerned about the human health effects of this plastic. And as Anthony has said, you find microplastics now in tap water. You find it also in bottled water, in soft drinks and beer. You find it in sea salt. There have been reports, of course, also of microplastics being present in certain types of seafood. So there's a question here. I don't know.
We'll take questions at the end.
We'll take questions at the end. Okay. So while I don't think there is any scientific evidence yet of any impact on human health, there are certainly lots of questions around this. So what can we do to address this problem? Essentially, there are 4 broad ways to address the environmental impacts that arise from waste plastics. First of all, we can reduce the amount of plastics, the amount of plastic waste by, for instance, replacing single-use plastics with reusable ones. For instance, switching from single-use carrier bags in supermarkets to bags that can be used several times. We can also substitute plastics with alternative materials ideally that are environmentally less harmful. For instance, by shifting from plastic pens to pens that are made out of cardboard or other material. Then, of course, we can also better design plastics to make them more sustainable. And for instance, plastics can be designed to be more easily recyclable. They can be designed to be biodegradable, or maybe what is more correct, compostable, which may be relevant in certain applications. And then last but not least, we can, of course, improve the way that we collect and treat plastic waste. And this includes, collecting more material for recycling. So all of these options will, of course, be important in addressing the plastics challenge. But here, the focus of this presentation is really on improving plastics recycling. And this is what the rest of the presentation now will focus on. So what is the current state of plastics recycling? Well, there's a large potential for improvement, I think one can say. Currently, only about 10 to 15% of plastics that appear in the waste stream are actually recycled. And as a consequence of that, the market share of recycled plastics in the overall plastics market is very low at about 10%. So why is this so? What we do in what we've done in our work over the past year or so is that we've essentially looked at the value chain of plastics recycling and the market for recycled plastics to understand where some of the obstacles lie. And we've essentially differentiated issues on the demand side and on the supply side of that market. So first on the demand side, there are a couple of issues here. What you see here on the graph is the price of recycled high-density polyethylene, clear bottles, versus the price curve for crude oil. And what you can see is that the price of recycled plastic is essentially tracking that pretty closely of crude oil. Recycled plastics, what this means is that recycled plastics really have to compete with virgin material in the market, and that is a problem, as we will see. I have a second graph here also which shows a different recycled plastic, which is recycled PET, which essentially comes from clear bottles or from bottles in general. And here we see that this is actually tracking the oil price, but not quite as well as it is tracking actually the cotton price. The reason for this is that the main application for recycled PET is in the textile sector. So, recycled PET is essentially a substitute for cotton, hence, the linkage there. So why is this problematic? Well, in both cases, recycled plastics are price takers, and fluctuations in prices are largely disconnected from the cost structure of recycled plastics, which leaves the industry exposed to price fluctuations in oil markets and cotton markets, and at times makes recycled plastic production unprofitable. The problem is that there's really a lack of a differentiated demand for recycled plastics, a demand that would be set, in a separate market, essentially more in line, and then potentially more in line with the costs of producing the material. Second issue that we identify on the demand side is that demand for waste plastics has been very concentrated in only one country, which is China. China has been able to process particularly lower grade material due to the low labor costs in the country, a large informal sector which is operating substandard operations and not always sort of complying with environmental regulations. So what you can see here on the graph is essentially the exports of waste plastics from the European Union into different countries which are represented by different colors. China is blue and Hong Kong is red, and you can see, and both of them are tightly connected, of course, and you can see that they really made up about 80-90% of the market most of the time. What has happened in the course of 2017 is that China introduced a ban and restrictions on the import of waste plastics, which has led the market to collapse. Essentially, between the moment where these restrictions kicked in and more or less today, almost 2/3 of that market simply disappeared. And some of it was reallocated, some of the exports were reallocated to other countries in Asia. But also these countries have begun to actually close their borders because they were overwhelmed by the amounts of plastic. So the consequence of all of this is that essentially the price for waste plastics has collapsed. In the exporting countries, there is a lack of capacity to process that material, which has resulted in stockpiling on factory yards, which has resulted in increasing amounts of material being sent to incinerators or landfills instead of recycling. So that's not good, and of course it's affecting the industry and the recycling industry in a bad way as well. Now, what can be done to address this situation? And we come up with a number of things that governments can do. First of all, governments can support the development of a separate demand for recycled plastics, and this can be done by a number of policies, such as introducing recycled content, product labels, such as introducing public procurement rules that require recycled content in certain products and applications, requiring recycled content across industries through product standards is another policy tool that is being discussed, and then taxing virgin plastics in order to internalize, the environmental costs that they produce. And one thing that shouldn't be forgotten is that, of course, there are fossil fuel subsidies that do exist in a lot of countries and that directly benefit virgin plastic producers because they get access to cheaper oil, basically. It's also clear that trade in waste plastics needs to be better managed so that material does not flow into countries that don't have the capacity to treat that waste in an environmentally sound manner. And maybe the Basel Convention, which essentially addresses transboundary movements of hazardous wastes, provides an example of how, this trade and waste plastics could be better managed. On the supply side, there are essentially three issues around quality, quantity, and resilience. First, quality. The cost of collecting, sorting, and processing waste plastics are relatively high, and there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, sources of plastic waste are geographically widely distributed and diverse in nature, which means that collection costs are very high. This is especially true for household waste, of course. Post-consumer plastics are then often contaminated with non-recyclable or non-target material, and each of us probably has their little role in this. No one is perfect, and each of us sometimes tosses, their waste into the wrong bin. Also, the way plastic products are designed is posing a challenge. So in particular, lots of packaging material really come in the form of combinations of polymers of different types, which makes the separation for recycling difficult or impossible. Then there are concerns over hazardous or otherwise problematic additives that are used in primary plastics, which can make their way into secondary plastics, can be, well, which makes them difficult to recycle as well. One example here is very simple. A lot of plastics contain pigments to provide color to plastics. And in fact, plastics, once it contains pigments, you can never use it again to produce a clear plastic. What you get, when you mix different colors together is essentially some kind of gray or dark gray plastic, and it immediately reduces the number of applications. And there are ways around, this. You can very well do away with pigments and instead have labels, that can be easily peeled off to provide different colors, for instance, to the plastic. And another problem also in this relation is that there's very little transparency about the additives that are contained in different plastics. Second, there's also a quantity issue, and I think here the first bullet makes it very clear. In the world, there are still 2 billion people who do not have access to basic waste collection. And I'm not even speaking about, the number of people who do not have access to separate waste collection, which is probably the majority of the population on this world, but I haven't found a number on this. Particularly of course, in developing countries and emerging economies, this is a big issue, but also in the OECD countries, and even those that have already separate waste collection for recyclable plastics, oftentimes important parts of that waste stream are not considered for recycling, and there's no infrastructure to treat it. So what a lot of countries do is that they collect bottles, and these are frequently recycled, but soft plastics typically not. And there are extra investments needed because the material is perfectly recyclable. So a lot of material essentially is still lost to landfills and incineration or to the environment. That also deprives the recycling sector and the recycling market of scale, which makes the competition with primary material more challenging. I'm coming to the end, Chair. Third point is that the market has limited resilience because it is essentially a sector which is characterized by a relatively large number of small firms. They are typically 10 times smaller than producers of primary plastics. And so then when you have market shocks, it is much more difficult for these firms to absorb them. It must be said that the industry is beginning to see this, and there's a wave of consolidations going on, but there's still a significant way to go. So what can be done about the supply issues? Well, what we do recommend is essentially to improve the quality of the recycled material and also the quantity of collected material. And this can be done through a number of policy intervention, including, of course, the introduction of dual or multiple stream collection systems, the introduction of extended producer responsibility systems, which already are in place in a lot of our member countries here in the OECD, deposit refund systems, which provide the possibility to collect a very high rate, up to 95% of what's actually put on the market, and really limit leakage. Restrictions on the use of hazardous and otherwise problematic substances, incentives for better plastic design, as I mentioned. I mean, you could, for instance, require, producers not to use pigments in the production of certain plastic packaging items. And then there are particular tasks for countries that are in development and emerging market economies that can be supported by official development assistance, which currently is very, very low for waste collection and treatment. So OECD countries, through their official development assistance, could support the development of infrastructure in these countries. What our work has also shown is that in such countries, there's often a very large informal sector. And it's important that any effort to improve waste management are really developed in an inclusive way, so as to ensure that informal sector operators such as waste pickers have a role, because otherwise they can easily undermine, it has been shown that they then tend to undermine a formal waste management system. So I think let me stop here. This is the publication that I was drawing from for this presentation, and so you can go there for more detail, but then I'm also going to be very happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. That was certainly a tour de force of the issues surrounding both the demand, supply and trade side of plastic recycling. There seem to be lots of policy options out there, huge challenges, both technical, social and economic, to be met. But I think there's certainly, as I mentioned at the outset, there certainly seems to be the moment for improving policy around plastics and in general, and plastics recycling in particular. So we will now open the floor for questions, and we have quite a few questions have flowed in via the web, but first of all, we might see if someone in the room here at OECD would like to kick off with questions. There was one down there. If you could state your name and where you're from.
Alistair Nolan, I work with STI, Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate. I actually had 3 questions very, very briefly. I raised my hand initially because you were talking about microplastics, and I just wondered what are the dimensions of these particles, these microplastics? Are we talking about nanoscale or the microns, etc.? That's one. Second, just to understand the technicality from a cost-benefit perspective, the recycling of already used plastics to make new plastics-based products, does that require a lot of energy input, a lot of heat? How does that balance out? And then the last thing, which is maybe slightly off target, but it's related, this issue of collecting already existing plastics which are in the oceans. I've seen a few ventures there. I know one failed recently, was brought back into harbor, I think in San Francisco or in the United States, but there's a number, these giant booms, etc., which are filtering out the plastics. What do we know about that option? Is this likely to be viable? Are governments putting any money in this direction, etc.?
Okay, thanks. Those are all very good questions. So microplastics are smaller than 5 millimeters, so they're bigger than nanoscale. But I think that's usually how they are defined. Sort of the cost benefits, energy intensity question. Typically recycled plastics, I mean, the technology that is most widely used to recycle plastics is so-called mechanical recycling, so which essentially involves just warming up the plastic and re-palletizing it, following some sorting, of course. And that has a very low energy intensity, is about 10 times less energy intensive than the production of virgin material. So there's a clear advantage also from the greenhouse gas perspective, for instance, in using recycled plastic rather than virgin. On the ocean cleanup, very good question. So first of all, I should say you probably need a little bit of everything, right? So there's no one, approach that will solve all of your problems. We have tended to focus more upstream on basically turning off the tap or stopping the bleeding of plastics into the environment more at the source. That's why we have been focusing on things such as the sustainable design of plastics and recycling. But of course, end of pipe solutions such as ocean cleanup techniques are also relevant. And of course, they will be very relevant in certain hotspots that you absolutely want to keep clean. A lot of cleanup is already happening on our beaches almost on a daily basis, especially in tourist spots. Now, I think the jury is still out whether any of these will actually find a business model. Any of these, technologies, and there's the ocean cleanup program, which is probably the best, the best known of these efforts because it is, a program which has been created by a young man by the name of Weston from the Netherlands, who created that project when he was 16. So. And it is probably one of the larger scale ones, but it's also run into trouble, as you point out. As I said, I don't think we have enough information at this time. There's a lot of experimentation going on, and the question remains whether there's going to be a business model around these. There are probably going to be business models around ocean cleanup efforts that are really targeted at coastal areas, because there, you have no jurisdictional issues and sort of the more immediate benefit. While, what Boy and Slut and the Ocean Cleanup Project are projecting to do, which is essentially, going into those plastic waste patches and collecting plastic waste in the open ocean, is harder to see how a business model might emerge around that, even though he's lined up a number of large corporations. I can't remember which they are, but who are actually willing to basically buy the recycled plastic from him at a premium.
Yeah, there's certainly no magic silver bullet to it, and there's going to be a lot of approaches required, and innovation, as I said at the outset, is happening all the time. So we have to let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we'll see which kind of techniques and innovations take hold. Other questions from Javier, please.
Thank you, Peter. I am Javier from the Chilean delegation. It's very interesting, but thinking beyond, because recycling is very important, but as far as we know, plastic can last for decades and centuries. And when you show this perspective of a fivefold increase in plastic, my feeling is we are kicking the problem to the next generation, but we are not solving really what to do with plastic in the environment. I remember when Switzerland presented its performance review, they are trying to treat all wastewater and all pollutants, including microplastic, for 2030, if I'm not wrong with the date. And this is the first country I hear intended to clean water from microplastic. And as you mentioned, I heard that microplastic is in bottled water, in tap water, in food, etc. So this, I repeat, is very important, but we need to think a long-lasting solution for this issue.
Is that a question? Or
it's a comment, a question, whatever you do.
Yeah, just very quickly. Of course, I mean, the question is it already too late? Because there's lots of plastic in our environment, particularly in the ocean. lots of it at the micro scale, which enters food chains, etc. And I don't think anyone, even Boyan Slat and the Ocean Cleanup Project, are really intending to clean up oceans entirely. You know, some fraction of plastic will always remain. Lots of it has actually probably sunken down to the ocean floor, has sedimented there, will degrade there at a slow rate. So, you know, I'm not an expert in this, I must say, but this is basically the question that you know, scientific research needs to provide answers to, whether, you know, the presence of plastics in the oceans that we already have is a severe threat to the environment and to humans.
Thanks, Peter. We'll take one more from the floor here, then we'll take a few questions from the web. Ron.
Yes, Ron Steenblick, retired OECD. Three very short technical questions. One is that you mentioned about trying to encourage manufacturers to move away from plastics with pigments and have labels. And I was just wondering how clean and how difficult it is to separate the label materials, so glue and paper, from the plastic in that process. Another is, you mentioned compostable plastics, and I've always wondered, what do they break down into? Are they just smaller pieces of plastic, or do they break down into, do the polymers themselves decompose into something more innocuous? And related to that, I see lots of promotion from companies trying to encourage bio-based plastics, so plastics derived from natural materials like vegetable oils. And I was wondering, do those end up in the with the same polymers that are largely indistinguishable from the petroleum-based polymers? In which case, what's the big advantage? Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to try and answer them quickly. So pigments, yeah, I mean, you already see some, you know, for instance, plastic bottles that have, you know, that are made of clear plastic and then have a colorful label around them. That apparently, according to some people in the industry, is a perfectly viable way, you know, to provide that sort of color property to a bottle without creating the problem in terms of the quality of the recycled material later on, and there are techniques to allow separation of the label and the bottle. Compostable plastics, there's a big debate about it. Certain types of biodegradable plastics have now already been banned because they have been proven to essentially just reach the stage of microplastics faster than, you know, normal plastics. Then, you know, other material, biodegradable material, I understand, only degrades to a certain extent, and there are discussions in ISO, the International Standards Organization, on, you know, what the sort of level of degradation should be, you know, that defines biodegradability. Should it be 50%, you know, or more? But I'm not sort of close to those discussions, so I can't say more. And finally, bio-based plastics, they are essentially identical molecules to the, you know, sort of virgin plastics. So the only advantage, supposedly, that they have is that they're made from renewable material. But to some extent, you probably run into similar issues as with biofuels with them pretty quickly when you scale up.
Thank you. We might turn to a few questions from online. We have quite a lot of questions. This has certainly generated some interest. So a question from Jacob Hasselblatt. Apologies for the pronunciation. Builds on the first question we had. What are the impacts on energy use and CO2 emissions of increasing plastic recycling rates. This is trying to link the climate agenda with plastics recycling.
Right, I think I more or less responded to that one. So as I think I said before, it's like a factor 5 to factor 10 difference in energy intensity. So now, if my memory serves me well, I think plastics production uses around 4% of oil production. So you would need to make the maths in terms of, you know, what's going to be, you know, if we manage to switch, which is impossible, switch all the primary material to secondary to recycled material, you know, what would be the effect? But the reality is that you could not do away entirely with primary plastics for a variety of reasons.
We have another one from Eric Weston, who in brackets said, thanks for the great presentation. So that's kudos, Peter. Question is, do you have a really good recent example of improved recycling rates in any market or country, and what was driving that improvement? Who are the best players? What was our model country we're all trying to aspire to?
I don't think that there is really a model country, but I mean, I think ultimately the best policy that we have to ensure that as little as possible is mismanaged, as little as possible waste is mismanaged, is really deposit refund systems. So, you know, with Denmark is doing this with plastic bottles, for instance, and they're reaching collection and recycling rates which are in the 90s, where other countries barely achieve 20%. Now, but this also has a cost, because a deposit refund system is more complex to put in place. It requires more infrastructure. There's a financial transaction attached to it. So it is more expensive to put in place than other policy options. But for sure, you know, a mix of different instruments, including deposit refund for certain types of plastics, also where you want to achieve a very high level of purity, for instance, and really go for closed loop recycling. Actually, some players in the bottling industry are envisaging this now. Extended producer responsibility systems, as they exist in a lot of countries, but maybe pushing the recycling targets beyond those that we've had in the past. And this is also what happens now following the EU's circular economy package. And you know, and a range of other instruments, such as also instruments that create a market for the recycled material, because it's you know, what the past years have or decades have shown, it's not sufficient to create a supply of recycled plastics because you don't immediately find a demand for it. You also need to create you know, incentives for market actors to actually demand that material. And that you can do, as outlined before, through you know, product labels, recycled content product labels, through public procurement instruments or product standards.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Please, Manola.
Thanks. Thank you, Peter. It's always been pretty enlightening and interesting, the work that you present to us. And this time was, as always, very enlightening. There's, in the international agenda, we have the UNFCCC, we have the CBD, we have the Desertification Convention, we have Basel Convention. We have, it seems to me that we have all sorts of international agendas, conventions, COPs for climate change, for biodiversity, for oceans, for hazardous transfer. And I've been trying to look at initiatives that can help us create that same type of political momentum internationally, and I don't see any. Do you have any idea of any type of, shall we say, United Nations effort to bring countries together to work in a more concrete political way to start banning plastics? And if we don't have any, how can the OECD help probably the UN system to start committing to a specific convention or political agenda to start banning plastics?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. I think it's a very good question, of course. First of all, I don't think that banning plastics is really the way, because plastics have many benefits. And actually, you know, when you try and find materials with which to substitute plastics, you often discover that the environmental footprint of those materials is actually, you know, larger. So if you replace a single-use carrier bag, plastic carrier bag, which is very thin, with a paper bag, you essentially need to use 5 or 6 times the amount of material and weight. And then you have a completely different environmental footprint. And so, you know, you need to be careful, and you need to apply life cycle analysis basically before you ban anything, even though, you know, some countries are clearly moving now with bans. So that is clearly something that is happening now. And there are certain product groups where this is a relevant approach. Now, in my presentation, I've said, I think, that at least as far as the trade in waste plastics is concerned, the Basel Convention could be an interesting model to look at, because what we've seen is that lots of plastics are collected in more affluent countries and then shipped to less affluent countries, mostly in Asia. And basically shipped to countries also that don't have the capacity to treat these plastics in an environmentally sound manner. And for the moment, up until now, there hasn't been really anything preventing exports of these materials, because they're not considered to be hazardous, so they don't fall within the Basel Convention. Yet they have you know, significant environmental impacts when they are processed in the wrong way, and China has taken a very hard decision to essentially ban the import of those materials because they consider that the environmental consequences of processing that material in their country were unacceptable. So you could imagine, you know, using the Basel framework, and I know there are some discussions in the framework of the Basel Convention to better manage the trade, and to essentially use a system of managed trade where you identify facilities that are allowed to receive imports of waste plastics, and thereby, you know, sort of achieve a better outcome for the environment.
So the China trade ban has been the catalyst for a lot of international action. It was certainly in the G7 last year. Canada's presidency made a big push on the marine plastics front. 5 years down the track, 10 years down the track, do you think we're going to look back and see this China trade ban as the catalyst for even greater action? Is this the thing that's going to change the course of the way in which we have innovation, way in which we change business models? Are we at a turning point?
Well, that's certainly what a lot of people think, and I think that's also what you can almost see. I think in part discussions around plastics taking place in the G7 or G20 framework have been triggered by this recognition that things have actually been going in the wrong direction in the past years, and that the possibility to export material into places such as China at a very low cost have essentially masked major deficiencies in the plastics recycling value chain. So recyclers are very excited because they see, that there's potentially huge market opportunity for them to expand their facilities, and the policy initiatives that are now being undertaken by a lot of countries also point into that direction. There is now a lot more support for better plastics management, better plastics design, better plastics recycling, product standards around those materials and bans than there used to be before. So I think we might well come to that conclusion, Anthony.
Good. Nice to be in on the ground floor of a turning point, if it's turning in the right direction, of course. We have time for one more question from the floor or online. Is anyone? Oh, there's one down the back there. Yes, thanks.
Sorry, yeah, Gwen Dubrow from the Natural Resources Policy Area of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate here in the OECD. You spoke a bit about supply side policies to reduce the flow of plastics into the waste stream, but I'm interested in the connections with policies in other sectors. In the agriculture space where we work, we see that a lot of things are driven by logistics, and the perceived need for packaging is to do with food safety and all of these kind of things. So have you had a look at broader policy changes that would reduce the perceived need for plastics in the packaging sector, especially in relation to food? Thank you.
That's a tough one.
It's on the agenda.
Now, of course, I mean, you're completely right. Of course, the use of plastics is driven by particular needs in different sectors, and packaging being a very large, it's mostly food packaging really, being a very large segment of the market. The agricultural sector and the food processing sector is, of course, a crucial one. I think, for sure, plastics have helped to actually diminish the amount of food waste and loss that we have, and also, of course, to increase decrease sanitary risks that are linked with sort of decaying food, linked to decaying food. So that direction is clear. Now, what can the sort of food sector do to help decrease plastics use? Well, I think the most important one is probably to look towards sort of more reusable forms of packaging, particularly sort of transport packaging, along the value chain. There are lots of things that are happening there already, and they can probably be increased. And then all the way to the final consumer and the packaging that is provided there. Some retailers are now switching to sort of, the opportunity for consumers to come into shop and just take the exact amount of cereals, for instance, that they want, and they can come with their Tupperware, glass or whatever, and fill it up. So there are, of course, issues surrounding, with sanitary issues surrounding that, but apparently it's doable, and if it could be mainstreamed, that it could make a real difference in terms of the amount of plastic that is required for packaging.
I'm told we have time for one more question, and we'll take it from online. There's been actually a stream of questions, been a lot of questions here, but there's been a stream of questions around business models and who is in the private sector, who are the leaders in driving the recycling in big companies like the multinationals. Are there any standout companies leading the way in terms of developing innovations, new business models, and so on?
Well, I think a sort of coalition that is particularly active and also sort of has a significant scale is the initiatives that are carried by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and their Global Plastics Pact, which is basically a voluntary initiative where, well, I think more than 100 large corporations, I'm not quite sure about the number, but large number of large corporations commit to undertake action to improve the way that they use plastics, including all the way at the design stage to undertake efforts there, incorporating more recycled material also. And so I think, yeah, there are lots of very exciting things happening, and it will be very interesting to see how these evolve, whether they might actually be sufficiently successful so that no major policy interventions might be required. Maybe these voluntary initiatives are going to scale up very quickly because some market actors are very concerned about the impact that unpleasant news like bottles on beaches and in the water are generating for their brands, and they're willing to put at least some money into solving that problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter. We've now come to the end of our time on plastics. I'd like to thank Peter for his speech and his answers to all these hard questions in the usual way. Thank you. So thank you very much to all the participants here in the room at OECD and to those who joined us on the web. I'd like to mention that if we have another slide here, the next Green Talk Live will happen in February, sometime in February, the date to be confirmed, where we will focus on the Global Material Resources Outlook to 2060, which was a major report that was released last year. And we look forward to having another seminar, another webinar on that topic very soon. So thanks again, and have a good evening.